Hebrews chapter 11 is where the sermon comes from this morning. If you would go ahead and begin to find a Bible maybe. Might have it on your cell phone or brought an app along with you, or you're welcome to follow along on the screen behind us or underneath the seat. There might be a Bible to follow along. So today we're in Hebrews chapter 11. This is the chapter that lists people of great faith. They did extraordinary things, but they really were ordinary people. This sermon series that Kent and I are going over takes a bunch of Old Testament people, men and women, and brings them before us for us to examine what they did so that we might have an extraordinary kind of faith. The faith chapter in Hebrews 11 tells us several people that were very ordinary people, men and women, and they did extraordinary things for God. So that's the idea, that you might be an ordinary person, but you can do extraordinary things for God. And faith was that thing that transformed them from the ordinary to the extraordinary. Today we're going to look at Jacob, who had a bucket list. Do you have a bucket list? Did you bring that with you this morning? Not a bucket to kick, but a bucket list. Do you know what a bucket list is? Okay. Well, I have no idea why people would put on a bucket list. You know, you're already dying, right? Why people would put on a bucket list things that would just kill you. Think about some of the things on people's bucket lists. If you're already dying, would you really want to go skydiving? What do you have to lose, right? And I guess that's how they look at it. But technically, you know, what do any of us have to lose? Why not do some more dangerous things? Not only skydiving, but some people say, well, I'd love to climb Mount Everest. Well, good luck with that. That's not dangerous at all. Try that. Whitewater rafting. Is that on your bucket list? How about running with the bulls? My wife came up with that one. I think she's trying to raise some money for me to be sent there, but I don't want to necessarily do that. Or some people say that you don't want to get in a car and drive it around the racetrack as fast as they can go. You know, all of those things are death-defying things. Why would you choose to do something like that? You're already dying, right? Jacob has a bucket list for us this morning. He lived right, and also he died right, and he leaves us an example of how we might follow in his place. He lists his bucket list. Call it a bucket list if you'd like. And I think that you and I can make these things on our bucket list as well. So here's our text, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21. Hebrews 11, verse 21. And it tells about Jacob. Now, Jacob, some of you are meeting Jacob for the very first time. Jacob is the guy whose name is changed later to Israel. And he has 12 children, more commonly known as the 12 tribes of Israel. So also a thing about Jacob, the book of Genesis, half of it is about Jacob. It's his life story. 150 or almost 150 years of Jacob's life is explained in Genesis. Almost 150 years of his life explained in half of Genesis. So you know Genesis is a long book. It's the first book in the Bible, right? But split it in half because from chapter 25 on through 49 is about this guy that we're looking at today. His name is Jacob. He had a bucket list, and we can develop a bucket list very similar to his. If you don't have one already this morning, I'd like for Jacob to provide that bucket list for us. And it doesn't include anything like climbing a mountain or skydiving in Sebastian or anything like that. I mean, these are things that you can all put on your bucket list. Let me read our text for this morning. It says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each one of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. Now you're thinking, how can we get a bucket list from this guy? That's just one verse. How can we get a bucket list from one verse in the Bible? Well, we will. The very first thing you'll notice is that Jacob When he was dying, he did some things. So he was dying. He knew that he was dying. Well, he is over 100 years old, maybe close to 140, maybe closer to 147, when he realizes that he is dying. You know, you'd think that would be something he'd pick up with in his 40s or 20s even. And it doesn't matter what your age is, all of us need to realize how frail we are. That's the first thing on the bucket list. Was this on Jacob's bucket list? You better believe it was. Recognizing his frailty, that any time his life may be snuffed out. A lot of times we think that we're indestructible. Do you think you're indestructible? Nothing ever hurt me. I can remember when I could roof the entire house, go to bed the next morning, I'm a little bit sore from roofing the house yesterday. And now when I get up out of bed, I think that pillow was underneath my head all night long. I can't move. I need to go to the doctor. We think that we're indestructible when in fact we're not. Let me mention a few things from Jacob's life that describe that he faced death a lot. He faced death all the time. You remember there was a story about he and his brother. They didn't get along real well because Jacob was always trying to make some kind of major deceit in Esau's life. He ran from Esau in chapter 28 of Genesis. In fact, he left his hometown. His mom said, "You better get out of here. We've been lying to Dad and your brother. Hit the road." So Jacob leaves. He goes to his uncle Laban's. And that doesn't work out real well. He leaves his uncle Laban's like that as well. And runs straight into Esau again, his brother. So he was fighting Esau, his uncle Laban, Esau again. And then he's out in the middle of nowhere. And what does he have to do but wrestle with God? You know, he's already fought his uncle. He's already fought his brother. Why not wrestle with God? One of the last things in Jacob's life that he dealt with was escaping a famine in his land. And he traveled all the way to Egypt. We'll look at that a little bit later. But he traveled all the way to Egypt to escape a great famine in chapter 46. Jacob lived every day like he was dying. He recognized his frailty. Jacob, our text even said, Jacob walked with a cane. I remember walking into I think it was a CVS or a Walgreens. I can't tell the difference when I'm inside, right? I walked into one of those drugstores and saw senior AIDS on the back, and I thought, man, seniors dealing with AIDS these days. So I got a little closer, could see it, and it said Band-Aids. You get it, right? Hearing aids, roll aids, walking aids, medical aid, government aid, you know, all those things in detail. We are living each and every day in a very frail clay existence. And it doesn't matter how old you are, the day that we were born, we all started dying. As a result of sin, the curse of sin is death, and the minute that we are born, we're all given a time clock. It would be best if we would live life to the fullest, to live as if we were dying. Jacob seems to be able to have done that on several of occasions, and you and I could as well. That was maybe one of the first bucket lists for Jacob, was he wanted to live like every day might be his last, to squeeze the most out of every day for God. And you and I need to look at each and every coming day as if it might be our last, and try to live each day with no regrets, to live life to its fullest. Everybody dies, but not everybody lives. And Jacob truly lived a full life for God. A guy by the name of Steve Jobs. I'm not sure if you know who that is. Maybe some of you have an Apple phone and could remember who Steve Jobs is. But Steve Jobs, several years ago, passed away. But he said this about death. And man, I didn't ever think I was going to be quoting from Steve Jobs in a sermon. But he said, Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make big choices in life. He said, remembering that you're going to die is the best way that I know to avoid the trap of thinking that you have something to lose. You're already naked. There's no reason not to follow your heart. He said, no one wants to die, and even people that want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there, right? Everybody want to go to heaven? Who wants to go today, right? Nobody raised their hand. Nobody wants to die to go to heaven, yet death is the destination that we all share. No one can ever escape it, and that's how it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention in life, and it's a life-changing agent. It clears out the old and makes way for the new. None of us want to realize that the mortality rate is 100%. All of us will encounter death, but not all of us will encounter life as we approach death. Jacob seems to be the kind of guy who figured out how to live a frail existence to the glory of God the best he could. Now, not too long ago, Kent and I preached through James, and you remember this passage in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15 that says, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city and spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. Isaiah points out that people are like grass, like the flowers of the field. We're here for just a moment, and then the breath of the Lord, he says, blows on them. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the Word of God stands forever. That's the only thing that's really lasting. Your life, not that lasting. My life, not that lasting. Jacob's life, even though he lived to be 147, he was frail. He went through many encounters in life where his life was nearly taken. Think of that one occasion where he wrestled God. And it seems that Jacob, we'll look at this again later, but even Jacob pinned God. But he didn't win. We'll look at his story a little bit later. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18, talk a little bit about our frailty. And in that text, Paul says, therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we're wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Because what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Are you fixing your eyes on eternal things or temporary things? So the guy in our text, Jacob, seems to have fixed his eyes on eternal things of God. Throughout many occasions in his life, he recognized his frailty. That was his first thing on his bucket list. I'm a frail person. Death is something that comes to all of us. Even though it's unwelcome, all of us will face that. Jacob faced it many times, and in fact, many times with his own family. But he recognized his frailty. The second thing on your bucket list today, if you want to make a bucket list like Jacob, the second thing that was on Jacob's bucket list, if you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21 again, you'll notice that Jacob tried to make amends with others. Here at the end of his life even, he's trying to make amends. He brings in the grandchildren of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, And he blesses those grandchildren as he's blessed his other grandchildren. Why is he blessing these grandchildren at the end of his life? Well, he didn't spend a whole lot of his life with these grandchildren. Maybe you remember the story of Jacob, who tried to make amends with others. Jacob had wrestled with many people. I was going to mention this a while ago, but let's look at all the people that Jacob wrestled with. He wrestled with his brother Esau. He's a twin. Are any of you twins? Twins? Yeah? Twins? Twins, and then in your family, there are twins, right? I remember seeing twins reappear over and over in some people's family. Once you have twins, and apparently Jacob is a twin. His brother Esau was the first baby to be delivered. And as the baby was being delivered, it says that Jacob had a hold of his heel. I don't know if that's a metaphor or if the baby really had a hold of his heel like that, but Jacob was a heel grasper. Jacob was right on the heel of Esau. Esau being the firstborn, you know that Jacob cheated his brother out of the firstborn right, and even out of the blessing. He wrestled with Esau. Jacob wrestled with his father-in-law, Laban. So here's the story of Jacob's romantic involvement. He meets a relative of his who has a daughter, and he thinks about maybe marrying that daughter. And Laban, his uncle, says, that'd be great. Work for me for 7 years. And when he does, Jacob gives him the older daughter, the one who's named Wild Cow, or Cow Eyes, Leah. And Jacob says, hey, whoa, this wrong daughter. We got the other daughter. That's the one I was. And he said, oh, yeah, well, if you work for me another 7 years, I'll give you that daughter. So he worked for him another 7 years. And by that time, Jacob and Rachel, they left Laban's house in the middle of the night. We're disappearing. We don't want to deal with Laban anymore. He fought with his father-in-law, Laban. And he did fight with the angel of the Lord. Genesis chapter 35, if you want to look that story up. But here's how it goes. So Jacob, he wants to communicate with God. And he longs to communicate with God. He lays his head down on a rock, goes to sleep, and wakes up later and decides that he is going to wrestle with God. He has a theophany. God appears to him. This happens several times in the Old Testament. The angel of the Lord appears in human form to individuals to bring and carry a message for them. And that happened with Jacob. It's a theophany that he wrestles with, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. And Jacob wrestles with him and pins him down and thinks that he has God pinned. And God touches Jacob's thigh, dislocates it. And from that period on, he has some problem with his sciatic nerve. Anybody have sciatic problems? Ooh. Does it make you walk with a limp? Well, maybe a cane would help, because that's what Jacob did. Jacob wrestled with everybody. In fact, you could say that he was a part of the WWF, but there is no F in Hebrew. So he was a part of the Vav Vav Zayin. I don't know. He was a wrestler. Are there people that you wrestle with constantly? Think of a few situations that you wrestle with, or people that you wrestle with. There were terrible things in Jacob's past. Terrible, unspeakable things. Things that you wouldn't even mention on a Sunday morning as a part of a sermon. But they're part of Jacob's life. Let me mention a few of them. I told you that he and his mother deceived Isaac, their father. He and his mother deceived their brother, Esau. He deceived his father-in-law, Laban. He started practicing polygamy, like the pagan cultures around him did. Now, you start to see this happen, maybe even in Abraham, right? But by the time you get to Jacob, it seems like he didn't have any restraint at all. Now, I mentioned before that throughout the Old Testament, you do find individuals who, without God's approval or blessing, they took more than one wife. I have no idea why any man would want to do that. Two anniversaries, two birthdays, two Christmases. It's too much. It was too much. But not only did Jacob practice polygamy, but he wanted to talk with God. And when God showed up, he decides that he's going to wrestle God. Jacob had one daughter. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story of Dinah. But his daughter was taken by one of the men of Shechem. And she was raped. Imagine that in his family. There are things that happen in the Old Testament that a lot of you wouldn't believe, that people survived. But there are a lot of people here today that went through a lot. You've got some painful things in your past. And wonder, how in the world am I ever going to make amends? How am I ever going to work through these problems and be a man or a woman for God? You don't know what's hidden in Jacob's past. You don't know what's hidden in our past. Jacob's sons became murderers. They murdered the men of Shechem. Worse than that, they also plotted to murder one of their own brothers, Joseph. And when they decided that, no, they're not going to murder him, they're just going to sell him into slavery. There were a lot of things that happened in Jacob's family. And blessing his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh, went a long way toward healing all of that trouble that was hidden in their past. Listen, if you've got things hidden, terrible things hidden in your past, try to make amends for those things. Be the one that starts a new habit in your family. Be the one that heads off into a new direction. If you've sown deep seeds of hate and bitterness in your family, if you have jealousy and strife, if you've planted these seeds over a period, you better pray for crop failure. You better hope that they don't come to fruition. We need to do all we can to get these things out of our lives and to make amends with others. Making amends with others is not always an enjoyable task. Sometimes you have to eat a lot of, what is that bird called? Crow. Yeah, that's it. Sometimes you have to apologize even though you didn't do anything wrong, right? We need to make amends. And if that's not on your bucket list, trying to make amends with family members and friends that you wrote off a long time ago and have nothing to do with. Try to make amends with those that you've wrestled with, that you've struggled with, like Jacob did. Try to make amends. And do this not only for your own sake, because it will make you feel better, but do it for the sake of witness, for the sake of the church, for the sake of Christ. Try to make amends with others. Jacob did. This was on his bucket list. And maybe this needs to be on your bucket list this morning. We know that Jesus mentioned in Matthew chapter 5 that if you're going to worship, but you have something that's on your heart, Jesus says, leave your gift on the altar there and go and make amends first and then come back and worship God. Making amends, it does make worship purer, easier. You know the times that you sit in church and you think, man, I wish this guy'd get done. I've heard enough of him, right? No, you really do begin to get something out of a relationship with others when you make amends for whatever wrong they've done, for whatever wrong you've done. First, Matthew chapter 5 says, first go and be reconciled to them, and then come offer your gift. You need to make amends with others, and chances are you know who those people are. I don't, not from up here, no way, but you do. Or maybe your wife does, or maybe your husband does, or maybe your mom does, or maybe your daughter knows exactly who you need to make amends with. But that needs to be on our bucket list, not just Jacob's bucket list, but on our bucket list as well, to try to make amends with others, to try to bring the family together, to try to make peace. Paul, when he's talking to the churches, he said something in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that I think is notable. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 20. Hey, if Paul was coming to church today, well, it'd be better than if the preacher was coming back, right? It'd be great to hear Paul, but think of what he said to the church at Corinth. He says, I'm afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want, or as I want you to be, and you may not find me as you want to find me. Paul is saying, when I get there, I might be upset that the fact that some of you are in discord with others, dealing with jealousy or fits of rage, selfish ambition, slander, gossip, arrogance, and discord. Discord is mentioned twice there in the NIV. Discord, unrest. That usually comes from immaturity and an inability for us to make amends. Paul told us to get rid of all bitterness and rage and anger and brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. And he says, instead, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another just as Christ in God forgave you. This was on Jacob's bucket list. Making amends with other people that you've offended, or maybe people that have offended you. It's on Jacob's bucket list. Is it on your bucket list? Third thing that's on Jacob's bucket list, if you'll follow along in our text, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21 is the one that speaks about Jacob. Jacob, at the end of his life, did something quite remarkable. He climbed up on top of his bed near the headboard, and there he worshiped God. That was on his bucket list, worship. Well, chances are it might be on yours today. You're here, right? Worship was on his bucket list. Now, look, no one wants to die in church, right? Although some of you are sleeping pretty sound. Nobody wants to die in church, right? But nobody wants to die the Sunday after skipping church, right? If you skip church, oh no, not that week. I'd rather die in church than skip church and then die. You know, we would seriously contemplate if we knew something were going to happen to us in the following week. We'd seriously contemplate whether or not to be at church and be on time, right? And to stay through the whole thing. And to make sure our phone's off so that we get the most out of church. In Jacob's dying days, at 147 years old, he climbs up on his bed. Now, I don't recommend doing that at any age, climbing in your bed. But he climbs up to the headboard, and there he worships. You know, some people are able to choose their last meal. They're inmates on death row, right? But if that's ever our case, what would you choose as your last meal? Would it be the holy meal that we've had a part of this morning? For our last meal, would we choose the Lord's Supper? Or would we choose, I've thought of this before. I think I would choose a never-ending buffet. Are you done yet? No? No, I'll take some more crab legs. This time don't be chintzy on them, right? You eat and you get up and go now. No, I think I'd choose an unending buffet. But Jacob, in his dying day, decides, not to skip over church. I'm 147, I can't get to church today. Well, That'd probably be understandable, okay? I get it, okay. But instead, he worships God. What did his worship include? Did he sing at the head of his bed? Did he pray at the head of the bed? Did he quote from the promises of God at the head of his bed? You know, promises that God had made him. I'm going to make you a great nation. And when I'm done with you, that nation is going to be like the sands of the seashore and like the stars of the sky. And yet Jacob is working on 12 unruly children that try to kill each other all the time. Jacob, he prioritized at the end of his life the thing that is very little priority in most of our lives: worship. Well, as long as it's an hour on Sunday, I can fit it in. If it's an hour and 15 minutes, I'm headed someplace else. How many bucket lists? You know, we mentioned some things that are on people's bucket list a while ago. Skydiving, whitewater rafting, running with the bulls. But how many people have on their bucket list worship of God? Hey, before I go from this earth, I want to worship God. Not necessarily while worshiping, right? But I want to worship. I want to be drawn close to God. I want to have that intimate relationship with God. Paul said in Philippians chapter 1, I'm torn between the two. And he's talking about living or being put to death. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better, but it's more necessary for me to remain in the body. So Paul lives a few more years, only to be thrown into prison again and executed. Paul desired to be with Christ. And when we face our frailty, when we face our own dying, when we face our bucket list, I hope that worship is on yours. Psalm 22, which is a very interesting psalm. Not Psalm 23. Most of you know that one. Read Psalm 22 sometime, though, when your eyes opened up. Psalm 22, one of the other shepherd psalms, is verse 29, says that all that go down to the dust will kneel before him. And, well, we know another passage from Philippians that says every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. In your dying day, in your days of dying, will you list worship as one of those things that just has to be a part of your life? Yeah, there are a lot of stories through Jacob's life, but at the end of his life, Paul in Hebrews chapter 11 says, this is what stood out. By faith, this guy recognized that he was frail. By faith, this guy tried his best to make amends in his family when there were a lot of dark secrets, terrible things that had gone on in Jacob's life. And by faith, Jacob seemed to be able to to muster up enough strength to worship God in his dying day. What do you have on your bucket list? You know, this morning, we've read this text over and over. Without faith, it is impossible for us to please God. Do you have the kind of faith that Jacob did that caused him to not only live right, but to die rightly as well? This morning, as we face an invitation time, let's go before God right now and ask Him to sort these things out in our minds. And then we'll have our invitation this morning. Let's pray. Our God in heaven, we're grateful for your word that would cause us to not only think about ourselves and our selfish needs through a life that is sick and dying every day. Lord, give us the ability to put you first in our lives as if nothing else remains and is important. Help us to have the kind of faith that these people, men and women in the Old Testament, had in you, that we might be examples not only to our family, but also to those who are lost. For we offer this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.